Thank you very much. Great pleasure to be here. Christian Union is not well known to me, and to see this group of young people gather on a cold night like this is heartening. I have a great love for this city. Came here in 1967 with two little boys. Lived up in Upper West Side. And the morning we arrived, we got here in the middle of the night, and morning I woke up the next day. We were just a half a block from Broadway. I walked out to Broadway to get something for breakfast for us, and I felt I had come home. The city just touched me. Those were the days when, just before the world began to fall apart. One of my most vivid memories was to see real miniskirts for the first time. Being a young man, married, but still, it was kind of a shocker. Any case, a pleasant shocker, but a shocker nevertheless. Anyway, I want to talk about freedom, and the more I thought about this, the more I realized that it's probably something that speaks directly to the lives that many of you are living. Freedom's a very big word. Freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom from slavery, freedom from cruel and oppressive rule, freedom from unjust laws, freedom from repressive institutions, freedom from domineering persons, and on and on. But there is another kind of freedom, another dimension to freedom, and that is what I'm calling spiritual freedom. The freedom to live as we were created to be, to have our minds and hearts set on what is good, what is true, and beautiful, on what we can love unconditionally. And what stands in the way of fulfillment, flourishing, is not what subjugates us from without, but rules within. You know the passage of St. Paul in the book of Romans. I can will what is right, but I cannot do it. For I do not do the good that I want, but the evil that I do not want is what I do. This is a bondage we can all understand and we all live with. For Paul, it is almost as though there are two wills within us. Shakespeare, as in so many other cases, saw this very clearly. There's a passage in Romeo and Juliet where Friar Lawrence is collecting herbs which had a healing power, but he knew could also be poisonous. And so Shakespeare uses herbs as a metaphor of human life. And here's what he says: two such opposed kings encamp them still in man as well as in herbs, grace and rude will. And where the worser is predominant, full soon the canker death eats up this plant. So if we are to speak about freedom, spiritual freedom, we must look within, for it is there that what rules is king. So there are two themes this evening. First, as I've already said, freedom is nourished from within. And secondly, that freedom is freedom for, not freedom from. That's really the key idea. To use the language of philosophy, freedom has to do with ends, that for which one is free. But first, let me just give you a few ideas as a kind of a backdrop from the scriptures about normal political understanding of freedom. The exodus of the Israelites from Egypt is the paradigmatic event of freedom from bondage. The Israelites had left the Holy Land to escape famine and settled in Egypt, where they were the slaves of Pharaoh. He set over them taskmasters who afflicted them with harsh, oppressive burdens. But under the leadership of Moses, the people fled the country and with God's strong right arm were able to cross the Red Sea and begin the long trek through the Sinai desert to return to their homeland. Note that the Israelites had a goal. They were not simply seeking to be free from slavery, but to be free to live as the people God had called them to be when he told Abraham to leave his homeland in Mesopotamia and to make the great journey west to the land of Jordan, the land God would give him and his descendants, because only there could they serve God without fear in holiness and righteousness before him all the days of their life. The Jewish Seder, a ritual meal each year, celebrates the deliverance from Egypt. But what makes this night different from all other nights, the little child asks, you tell the child on that day, it is because of what the Lord did for me. Not for them, but for me when I came out of Egypt. Over the centuries, the Passover became the occasion for fervent prayer that God would deliver the Jewish people from whatever form of bondage they may be suffering. But the Exodus is not simply a Jewish story. It became a metaphor for freedom from oppression. During the civil rights struggle in this country in the 1960s, Martin Luther King quoted the verse from Exodus, "Let my people go." Not to speak of deliverance of the Israelites, but of freedom for the black people from the evils of segregation. And the most popular song of the civil rights movement, "We Shall Overcome," echoes the Exodus. The Lord will see us through. The Lord will see us through. The Lord will see us through someday. And Christians were, of course, players in this great struggle to free blacks from their inferior status in American society. But for Christians, the story of the Exodus is not simply a story about a people seeking political and legal freedom and human dignity. As Exodus was read and interpreted in the early centuries, it became a story of spiritual freedom. The first sermon in the 2nd century that we possess from the early centuries was preached on the great Paschal festival, the Christian Passover, and is based on the account of the Exodus in the book of Exodus. The scripture has been read, how the sheep is sacrificed, how the people is saved, and how Pharaoh is scourged through the mystery. And then this early Christian preacher says, instead of the lamb, there was a son, and instead of the sheep, a man. He was interpreting the words of St. Paul in 1 Corinthians 10. I want you to know that our fathers were under the crowd that led the Israelites in the desert, and were all baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea. As deliverance from Egypt required that the Israelites go through the Red Sea, so for the Christians, deliverance from sin requires that the believer pass through the waters of baptism. So Exodus, Easter, baptism, Christian life. And in the baptismal rite, at least in some churches, these words are spoken. Through the waters of the Red Sea, you led Israel out of slavery to be an image of God's holy people, set free from sin by baptism. Now, this truth, in its most potent form, is found in the words of Jesus in the Gospel of John. If you continue in my word, you are truly my disciples, and you will know the truth, and the truth will make you free. Transition from the political to the spiritual. And as you know, the people who were listening to him could not understand what he meant. because the only freedom that they knew was freedom from bondage to a foreign king. So they said, we are descendants of Abraham and have never been in bondage to anyone. How is it that you say you will make us free? To which Jesus responds, if the Son makes you free, you will be free indeed. He was saying something new, something surprising, something that no one else had ever said before, because he was speaking about a different kind of freedom. As he puts it elsewhere, the freedom to have life and to have it abundantly. So the goal then is life in its fullness, freedom for excellence, freedom for flourishing, liberation from the things that prevent us from living a truly human life. The truth will make you free. What does that mean? The truth. In the scriptures, truth is not a philosophical or a theological idea. It's not a concept. It's not an abstract principle. It's not a proposition to be grasped by the mind. Truth is an adjective, meaning faithful, reliable, trustworthy, to deal truly with someone, to speak truly, to judge truly. It has to do more with actions and relations than with ideas. Beautiful line from the Psalms. Teach me thy ways that I may walk in thy truth. So when the Gospel of John uses the word truth, it means that God is faithful and can be trusted. So much that one can build one's life on God's word. I am the way, the truth, and the life, says Jesus. To have life and to have it abundantly is to live oriented toward a transcendent good that orders our desires and gives purpose and direction to one's life. Say that again. To have life and to have it abundantly is to live oriented toward a good that orders our desires and gives purpose and direction to one's life. What does that mean? It means to live without fear, to discipline our passions and our unruly desires, the rude will of Shakespeare, to quench the fires of ambition, to purge the toxin of greed, to rise above the ceaseless pursuit of status and success and security. This kind of freedom begins within and is nurtured from within. And again, it was a biblical writer who understood this, St. Paul, more than any other. Let me quote again the words from Romans. I can will what is right, but I cannot do it. For I do not do the good that I want, but the evil I do not want is what I do. Then he adds, now if I do what I do not want, it is no longer I that do it, but sin which dwells within me. Very strange language. He speaks as though there are two persons dwelling in each of us, two eyes that drive our actions. The fractious and disobedient will, what he calls sin, and the other eye, by which he means his true self. But the two are at war within his soul, and he yearns to be free of the powers that made him captive. Again, to quote Shakespeare, from The Tempest, Prospero, this thing of darkness I acknowledge mine. So within us, the two are at war. Now, St. Paul calls the genuine I his inner man. But the inner man is not simply one's thoughts and feelings. It is more than the self that directs our thoughts and actions and feelings. The inner man is where we find God. And there was no better interpreter of this than St. Augustine. You're no doubt familiar with the parable of the prodigal son in the Gospel of Luke. There was a man who had 2 sons, and when he came to maturity, the younger son said, "Give me the share of property that falls to me." So the father divided his living between them. The younger son took what he had and traveled to a far country, where he squandered his inheritance. When he had lost everything, he went to work for a pig farmer, and he was so hungry, he would gladly have eaten the corn cobs that the swines were eating. He realized that his father's servants lived better than he did. So he began to think of returning home. And when he had made the decision, you know what he said? What does the gospel tell us? Anybody know the line? He comes to himself. He comes to himself. There's no more beautiful words in the whole of the Bible, because it was in coming to himself that he found the way back to God. Augustine realized that the way to God was not through studying the teachings of the philosophers, not through mastering history, not through examining social and political institutions, not contemplating nature. He loved the parable. I turned toward myself and said to myself, "Who are you?" I replied, "A man. I see in myself a body and a soul, the one external, the other internal. Which of these should I have asked about my God, for whom I had already searched through the physical order from earth to heaven, so far as I could send the rays of my eyes as messengers?" Then he says, all physical evidence is reported to the mind, which presides and judges of the responses of heaven and earth, and all things in heaven and earth, and all things in them, as they say, "We are not God, and he made us." And then Augustine says, the inner man knows this. Exactly the same language that St. Paul uses, the inner man. When one looks within, then, said Augustine, one sees a light unlike any other light, for the inner self, free of the distraction of the senses, penetrates deeply into things. The inner man has eyes that are not distracted by the many sensations that constantly bombard our senses. So spiritual freedom is a matter, an affair of seeing, but knowing where to look. As human beings with bodies and perception that act through the senses, what we know of the world comes through seeing, hearing, touching, feeling, smelling. But it is only as these things are filtered through the inner man that we grasp what we see and we hear. For Augustine, however, the inner man is not only or even primarily the mind, because it also includes the affections, the actions of the heart, of love. So seeing is closely linked to loving. The beautiful passage in Ephesians, again of Paul. I pray, he writes, that God will give you a spirit of wisdom to know him. Listen to this next clause. Having the eyes of your heart enlightened that you may know. The eyes of the heart enlightened that you may know. In other words, the heart is the organ that allows us to know, in the sense of knowing what we love. Put it again. The heart is the guide, for only in love can one see things as they are. This is only in love can we know another person. Because love is unitive. Love allows us to enter in to the life of another person in a way that we cannot do simply by looking and thinking with the mind. So in the scriptures, heart, unlike our conventional use of the term, refers to feelings and emotions, but also to understanding and to knowledge. The prophet Isaiah says, one understands with the heart. The heart discerns good and evil and gives one the wisdom to judge rightly. The psalmist says, the law of God is in the heart, not in the mind, because it is with the heart that we come face to face with God. In the words of Jesus, blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. Augustine's Confessions, as many of you have read, is a search for wisdom. Before he came to know the scriptures, the book that made the deepest impression on him was Cicero's Hortensius. It's a book on philosophy. And this is what Augustine says. This book changed my feelings. What an extraordinary thing to say. And then Augustine says, it altered what I longed for and desired. It did not change his mind, it changed what he loved. When I used to teach at the University of Virginia and be teaching a large lower level undergraduate course on the history of Christianity, and we read the Confessions, I would say to them, you're going to read many books while you're in college, and they will change what you think. But if you read one book that changes what you love, then you've read something important. Because love, finally, is what drives our heart, our mind, all of us. So what does it have to do with freedom? When Jesus says the truth will make you free, he means it is only as we turn away from the gods of this world and the heart is turned to love God can we be genuinely free as human beings, or better simply, to live. Now, there is no deeper interpreter of Paul's inner man than St. Augustine. Just as there is no deeper interpreter, so there is no more profound understanding of the words of Jesus, the truth will make you free, than Dostoevsky, the great Russian novelist, and particularly in his Brothers Karamazov, The Legend of the Grand Inquisitor. At the beginning of the tale, because that's what it is, Dostoevsky quotes a line from the poet Schiller. Have faith in the heart's promptings, for the heavens give no pledge. And that's the secret to understanding the story. Have faith in the promptings of the heart, for the heavens, that is something external to you, doesn't give you anything that you can count on. First, a little background. If you've read the book, and I certainly hope you have, there are three brothers. Ivan, the rationalist and skeptic, and he's the one who tells the story of the Grand Inquisitor. There's Dmitri, who's a man of passion. If you see any movies of the Grand Inquisitor, of the Brothers Karamazov, Dmitri is going to be the one who's featured. Dmitri and Grushenka. And then there's the younger brother, Alyosha, and Alyosha then is moved by love. But the story of the Grand Inquisitor then is a debate between Ivan and Alyosha. It's not about the passions, it's about the mind and the heart. And the story goes this way. 15th century Spain. where the Inquisition is in full flower. And out of nowhere, Jesus appears. Quietly, inconspicuously, but strange to say, everybody recognized him. There's a great commotion among the people, and the Grand Inquisitor walks into the crowd. An old man, almost 90, tall and straight, with a gaunt face and sunken eyes, from which a glitter still shines like a fiery spark. And it's the Grand Inquisitor who begins the conversation with Jesus. Why have you come to interfere with us? I know what you said centuries ago, and I know what has happened since then. You spoke to men and women of freedom. In the words of the gospel, I want to make you free. If the Son makes you free, you will be free indeed. But we know, says the Grand Inquisitor, that people really do not want freedom. So we have undone what you gave them and given them what they really want: bread, mystery or miracle, and authority. Things that can hold people, to bind and enslave them. The people, he says, have brought us, here, the church, their freedom, and obediently laid it at our feet. We have finally overcome freedom and have done so in order to make people happy. So you promised freedom, but we learned that people do not want freedom. They want to be happy. They want bread. They want miracle. They want authority. So what he's saying is, Dostoevsky, happiness does not bring freedom. And that leads then to a meditation on the three temptations of Jesus in the Gospels. Jesus is led into the wilderness to be tempted by the devil. He'd been fasting and he was hungry. So the first temptation, the devil comes and he says, if you're a son of God, command this stone to become bread. And Jesus answers by quoting Deuteronomy. Man does not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds out of the mouth of the Lord. Second temptation. The devil takes Jesus to a high mountain and showed him all the kingdoms of the world and their glory. All these I will give you if you will fall down and worship me. Jesus responds, you shall worship the Lord your God, and him only you shall serve. And then the third temptation. The devil takes Jesus to the pinnacle of the temple, and the devil says, if you are the Son of God, throw yourself down. For it is written, he will give his angels charge of you, and on their hands they will bear you up, lest you strike your foot against a stone. To which Jesus responds, again it is written, you shall not tempt the Lord your God. So the three temptations are bread, material things, authority, whom you shall worship, and miracle, throwing himself down from the top of them. And what does Dostoevsky do with it? The temptations, he says, are about the freedom found, and here's the key word, in obedience to God. The freedom of faith, as Ivan puts it, faith in what the heart tells you. This is what Christ gave mankind. But they did not want it. What they wanted was to be happy. And the Grand Inquisitor, he's marvelous. Nothing has been more insufferable for man and for human society than freedom. That's why they had to get rid of it. So bread is a metaphor for material things, things needed for life, food, shelter, security, and the like. But Dostoevsky asks, What sort of freedom is it if obedience is bought with loaves of bread? It doesn't take much historical imagination or historical knowledge to know how that has played itself out in modern times and is playing itself out today. So he says, Dostoevsky, in resisting the temptation to turn the stones into bread, Christ gave us an example of the moral strength needed to overcome the seduction of a false god, that is, the wiles of the devil. Had he accepted the loaf from the devil, he would have answered the most important question for a human being. Before whom should I bow down? For human beings, above all else, are looking for someone or something to bow down to. And here Dostoevsky goes to the heart of the matter. Man seeks to bow down before that which is indisputable, something that on the evidence of it, bread, miracle, authority, is indisputable. But that is precisely what faith is not. Hebrews 11:1. Faith is the conviction of things not seen. Faith believes and trusts and acts on a truth that cannot be grasped. In other words, something that is disputable by our senses and experience. Because men seek what is unassailable, the evidence of the senses, the authority backed by power, the rewards of money and status, man turns eagerly and hands his freedom over to those who would give them these things. So by rejecting the temptations of the devil, Christ shows that the mystery of man's being, now I'm quoting Dostoevsky, the mystery of man's being is not only in living, but in what one lives for. And he explains then, instead of a firm ancient law that is clear directives of what we should do, a man must decide for himself with a free heart what is good and what is evil, having only Christ's image before him as a guide. So freedom is more than choice. That is, the ability to do one thing in preference to another. Freedom from, which is the conventional way we understand it. Freedom without knowing what it is that one is free for. But this kind of freedom is vacuous, aimless, like setting out on a journey ignorant of where one is heading. Freedom for is freedom that is oriented toward a goal, oriented toward human flourishing, oriented toward excellence, which is the original meaning of virtue. And so Dostoevsky finally comes to the great paradox. True freedom is found in obedience. Just the reverse of our conventional understanding. And this finally is what Jesus is talking about. The Israelites had to learn this again and again by hard experience. The first commandment said, I am the Lord your God. You shall have no other gods before me. The commandment demanded fidelity to God. But again and again, they turned, the Israelites, to other gods and did what was evil in the Lord's sight. And the result was bondage to yet another imperious foreign king. Because it was only in obedience to the one God that they could be free. But they turned again and again to other gods and found themselves in bondage, as in the days of Pharaoh. Now Alyosha is listening to this tale. The young brother, the brother who lives by love. And as the tale unfolds, Alyosha is puzzled and says, I don't understand it. Is the Grand Inquisitor being ironic, telling a story of Jesus coming back? And he says, we don't need you anymore. Is he laughing at Jesus? But then finally, it hits him, and he understands. And he says, your poem is in praise of Jesus, not in blame of him. For the tale honors Christ for preserving human freedom by turning us to the one obedience that can be the firm foundation of life. The truth that makes you free. And then he says, you shall worship the Lord your God, and him only shall you serve. And even the Grand Inquisitor acknowledged that he had only reluctantly abandoned the true Christ and still felt the power of the image of Christ presented in the Gospels. I too prized the freedom Christ had given us, but I could not live with his freedom. So tomorrow, the narrator tells us, the Grand Inquisitor will order Christ to be burned at the stake. So the moral is, there's nothing wrong with bread, nothing wrong with miracle or mystery and authority. But when they displace genuine faith, the faith of total obedience to God, they take away our freedom. Then they become magic, mystification, and tyranny, the tools of the false prophet. So the prodigal son came to himself. After wandering off in search of what he knew not, he looked within and he found himself. But what he found was a new self. It was a self who was now capable of loving his father and enjoying the freedom of a son who was obedient. In the parable, the father is, of course, God. And it's a tale of the way back to God, of conversion, if you will. Because we are made in God's image, our lives will be free and truly human only as they are found turned toward God. In the end, conclusion then, there's one passage which particularly touched me near the end of the Brothers Karamazov. It's not part of the Grand Inquisitor. When Alyosha is speaking with a young man with very liberal ideas, a free thinker. And this person says, what if God does not exist? To which Alyosha, and here Dostoevsky speaking, responds, I keep thinking of this, but then I think, if God does not exist, whom will we love? To whom shall we be thankful? To whom will we sing hymns? Thank you very much.